It was a chilly autumn morning when Mrs. Reynolds first noticed him, the boy who always sat in the back of her classroom, head down, avoiding eye contact. His clothes were a little worn, his backpack barely zipped, and his notebook mostly blank. While the other students laughed and whispered to each other before class, he remained silent, staring out the window as if lost in another world. His name was Daniel, a quiet, withdrawn kid who never caused trouble, but never quite fit in either. He was the kind of student most teachers might overlook, not because they didn't care, but because he made himself invisible. But Mrs. Reynolds had been teaching long enough to recognize the signs: the tired eyes, the hesitation when asked a question, the way his fingers fidgeted with his sleeves, as if trying to hold himself together. She had seen it before. Students struggling, not just with grades, but with life itself. One afternoon, after the final bell rang and the other students rushed out, she called his name. "Daniel, can you stay for a moment?" He froze, gripping the strap of his backpack. "Did I do something wrong?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Reynolds smiled gently. "Not at all. I just wanted to check in. How are you doing?" At first, he shrugged. "I'm fine." But she didn't let it go. "Are you sure? Because I've noticed you've been having a hard time in class. And that's okay. I just want to help." Daniel hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his chair. He glanced at the door, as if debating whether to run or stay. Finally, he exhaled. "I don't think I'm smart enough for this." Those words hit Mrs. Reynolds harder than she expected. She had seen students struggle with math, with reading, with science. But it was different when a child struggled with believing in themselves. She leaned forward. "Daniel, let me tell you something. You are smart. You are capable. And I know school isn't easy, but that doesn't mean you don't belong here." He didn't say anything, just stared at his desk. "How about this?" she continued, reaching into her drawer and pulling out a notebook. "Let's work together, just a little bit every day. We'll figure this out." He looked at the notebook, then at her. There was doubt in his eyes, but there was also something else, something she hadn't seen before. Hope, and so it began. Every afternoon, Daniel stayed behind. At first, it was just for a few minutes, then a little longer. Mrs. Reynolds helped him with his schoolwork, but more importantly, she helped him believe in himself. She encouraged him when he stumbled and celebrated his small victories. She made sure he knew that he wasn't alone. As the weeks turned into months, something changed in Daniel. He started answering questions in class. His grades improved. He even made a few friends. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning to thrive. Mrs. Reynolds never expected anything in return. That wasn't why she became a teacher. But years later, long after Daniel had left her classroom, she would receive a phone call that would change everything. A voice she barely recognized spoke on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Reynolds, I don't know if you remember me, but my name is Daniel, and I've been looking for you for a long time." She frowned, trying to place the name. And then, like a forgotten melody, it all came rushing back. Daniel, the quiet boy who used to sit in the back of her classroom. "I have something for you," he continued, his voice filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "A gift. For everything you did for me." Mrs. Reynolds was about to say that no gift was necessary, that seeing her students succeed was more than enough. But before she could, Daniel added something that left her speechless. "You changed my life. And now, I want to change yours." She didn't know it yet, but her kindness all those years ago had set off a chain reaction, one that would lead Daniel to a life she never could have imagined. And soon, she would discover just how far that kindness had traveled. Mrs. Reynolds clutched the phone, her heart pounding. It had been so many years since she had last seen Daniel. but she could still remember the boy who had once doubted himself, the boy who had struggled to find his place. And now, here he was, a grown man, his voice steady and confident, so different from the quiet, uncertain child she had known. "I don't understand," she finally said. "A gift? What do you mean?" Daniel chuckled softly. "It's a long story, but if you're free, I'd love to meet in person." There was something in his tone, an urgency, but also a warmth. Mrs. Reynolds hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. They settled on a small cafe in town, a place she used to visit after long days of grading papers. It felt surreal, knowing she was about to see a student she had once worried about so deeply. When the day arrived, Mrs. Reynolds found herself nervously adjusting her cardigan as she stepped inside the cafe. She scanned the room until her eyes landed on a man sitting by the window. He stood as soon as he saw her, a wide smile on his face. She almost didn't recognize him. The Daniel she remembered had been small for his age, always hunched over his desk, as if trying to disappear. But the man before her stood tall, his handshake firm, his presence confident. "It's so good to see you," he said, pulling out a chair for her. She smiled, still trying to process how much he had changed. "It's good to see you too, Daniel." They sat, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then Daniel sighed, his expression turning serious. "Mrs. Reynolds, I don't think you ever really knew what you did for me." She tilted her head. "I just helped you with your schoolwork." "Daniel, that's what teachers do." He shook his head. "It was more than that." He glanced down at his hands before continuing. "Back then, things at home weren't great. My mom worked late shifts. My dad wasn't around. And most nights, I went to bed hungry. School felt impossible. Every time I opened a book, it just reminded me how behind I was. I started believing I wasn't meant for anything more." Mrs. Reynolds felt a lump form in her throat. She had suspected Daniel had struggles outside the classroom, but hearing him say it now, all these years later, made her heart ache. "But you," Daniel continued, meeting her gaze, "you didn't give up on me. You stayed after school. You told me I was smart when I didn't believe it, and that changed everything." She smiled, eyes misty. "I always knew you had it in you, Daniel." He nodded, his expression growing intense. "That's why I worked so hard. I had to prove to myself that you were right about me. And, Mrs. Reynolds, I did it. I built something. A business." She blinked in surprise. "A business?" He grinned. "A pretty successful one. I started from nothing, but I learned everything I could. Failures, setbacks, long nights. I went through it all, but I made it." He leaned forward, his eyes shining. "And none of it would have happened if you hadn't helped me when I needed it most." Mrs. Reynolds was speechless. She had spent her entire career pouring her heart into her students, never knowing where their lives would take them. And now, here was Daniel, a boy she had once worried might not graduate, sitting before her as a man who had built something incredible. She placed a hand over his. "I am so proud of you, Daniel." His smile faltered slightly, replaced by something more serious. "That's why I wanted to find you. I wanted to say thank you, but I also wanted to do something more." Mrs. Reynolds furrowed her brows. "More?" He exhaled. "I know you probably don't think you need anything, but I also know how hard teachers work, how much they give, and how little they get in return. So I decided, no, I promised myself, that one day I'd give back to the person who gave me a chance." Mrs. Reynolds shook her head, already overwhelmed. "Daniel, just hearing that I helped you is enough. You don't have to." He reached into his pocket and slid a small envelope across the table. "Please," he said softly. "Just open it." She hesitated, then carefully picked it up and unfolded the paper inside. As her eyes scanned the words, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a letter. It was a life-changing gesture, something she never could have expected, something that would alter her future forever. She looked up at Daniel, her hands trembling. "Daniel, this is..." He smiled. "This is only the beginning." And in that moment, Mrs. Reynolds realized that the kindness she had given so freely, all those years ago, had come full circle in a way she never could have imagined. Mrs. Reynolds stared at the paper in her hands, her eyes wide. Her fingers trembled as she reread the words, making sure she wasn't imagining things. A check, a sum so large it almost didn't seem real, made out in her name. Her heart pounded. "Daniel, I can't accept this." Daniel smiled, the same warm, determined expression she remembered from years ago. "Yes, you can." Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. "This is too much. I don't even know what to say." He leaned forward, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "Mrs. Reynolds, you gave me something more valuable than money. You gave me a future. You made me believe in myself when no one else did. This is the least I can do." She looked at him, truly looked at him. The boy she had once worried about, now a successful man sitting across from her, offering her a gift that could change her life. It wasn't just about the money, it was what it represented, a full circle moment, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave a mark that lasted forever. "But why now?" she asked softly. "After all these years," Daniel took a deep breath. "Because I know how much teachers sacrifice. I know you spent late nights grading papers, using your own money to buy supplies, staying after school to help kids like me when you didn't have to. And I also know that sometimes people who give the most never get anything in return." He smiled. "So, I wanted to change that. For you." Mrs. Reynolds wiped a tear from her cheek, her emotions overwhelming her. She had spent her whole career believing her reward was in the success of her students, and it was. But this was something she never expected. She exhaled, holding the check carefully in her hands. "Daniel, I don't know what to say," he chuckled. "Then don't say anything. Just promise me one thing." She looked at him curiously. "What's that?" "Do something for yourself," he said. "Something that makes you happy." Mrs. Reynolds let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd be in this position, having a former student tell me to take care of myself." Daniel grinned. "Well, you spent years taking care of others. It's only fair." For a long moment, they just sat there, the weight of the moment settling between them. Then, Mrs. Reynolds placed the check down and reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I always knew you would do something great," she whispered. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "I had a great teacher." As they sat there, the past and present colliding in the quiet hum of the cafe, Mrs. Reynolds realized something. The impact of a single act of kindness didn't just end when the moment passed. It rippled outward, shaping lives in ways no one could predict. And now, years later, she was witnessing the full circle of that kindness. Proof that even the smallest gestures could change a life, maybe even more than one.